Hi everyone! In this video, I'll show you block number 7 for July 2021 in our Jelly Roll Block of the Month Challenge. If you'd like to join in on this block of the month, look right below this video in the description for a link to my Facebook group, and that's where you'll find everything you need to participate. So we're going to be doing a checkerboard pattern for this month for July. Rather than do all the same color, we're going to add a pop of color to the center to make it a little different. It doesn't really show up on this draft printout I did of the PDF. And as always, the PDF will be included in the group file. So if you like written instructions, you'll have that. So what you're going to need for this block is one strip of a dark color and one strip of a light color. You want a good contrast so your checkerboard is very visible. And you're also going to need two pieces, different from what you're using for your checkerboard. And they are 2.5 wide, like the strips, by 5 inches long. You'd like those to contrast also, so a medium or dark with a lighter color. So these are for the center of my checkerboard. And I did cut my strip in half to keep it in the camera. Also, it's easier to keep your sewing nice and straight with shorter strips. But if you're comfortable sewing the full length of your strips, you can go ahead and do that. So all we're going to do is sew together a dark strip with your light strip. Line them up nice and straight. You're going to use a 1/4 inch seam along one edge and press towards the dark side. We're going to be subcutting into 2.5 inch pieces, so you definitely want to use a smaller stitch. If you use a long stitch, all the subcuts, you risk them coming apart. So use a shorter stitch when you do this seam. So I'm going to get those two done. I'm also going to sew this together, again with a 1/4 inch seam. And I'll come back and we'll start our subcuts. So I'm back with my strips sewn. The little 5-inch strips I've pressed. I've used, I believe, 2 setting for my stitch. I did a short stitch and I've pressed towards the darker fabric. The reason for pressing everything towards the darker fabric is when you subcut and flip one around, you'll automatically be in a good place to nest. So let's cut this one just to show you what I mean. My edge is nice and straight. So I'm just going to cut it at 2.5. There we go. There's my 2 pieces for the center. And you can see I flip one over to get a checkerboard. And now my seams are both going towards the darker fabric. So it's perfectly aligned for nesting to create my little 4.5 inch square. So that's why we press them all towards the darker fabric. So as you can see on this one, press towards the darker fabric. So this one I've already subcut into 2.5 inch strips, so this video wouldn't be too long. So on this one, here's an excess piece, so I didn't get through that. Just cut that off. There we go. So I have 8 pieces. I have the dark square facing up, which isn't super important. But on this one, I'm going to turn it around with my white square facing up just to make it easier when I start placing my fabric. So I'm going to start just by taking the edge off so I have a nice straight clean edge to work with. And I'm going to cut 8 strips of 2.5 inches. One, two, and there we go. We have 8 more. So that's a total of 16. And our 2 for the center. And we'll lay out our block. We'll use a dark up, white up. We're going for a checkerboard. Dark up, white, dark, and white. So we have a total of 6 across. Then on this one, dark and white. Then we'll use our 2 colors for the center, dark, whoops, and light. I just thought it would be fun to add a pop of color in the center. And then dark again and light. There you have 6 pieces across. And then we finish the bottom row exactly like the top row. So we have a dark, dark, and a dark. And then the light, and the light. So there's our checkerboard. So what we're going to do now is create squares of 4.5 inch. So we're going to sew 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then we'll attach the rows together and sew the rows into a block. So I'll start with these. Be very careful to nest your seams. You want your seams to line up really nice so that you can have nice straight blocks going down or straight squares. We'll get these done and I'll be back and continue with row 2 and row 3. Don't forget to press between each square. And here are my 3 squares. All nicely nested. You can see my corners line up really nice, which will help me as I work down. I've pressed all these 3 towards the left side, and on this row I will press towards the right side. So once again, when I need to nest, it will be easier. My seams will be all ready. So we'll do these 3. And here's our second row. And I've pressed my seams to the right, the opposite of what I did on the first row. That will make nesting a lot easier. So in this block, there's a lot of nesting, so it will give you lots of practice. And we'll finish the third row and go on to the next step. On this row, again, I'm going to press towards the left as I did on the first row. And our last 3 squares, press towards the left. And you can see that I've taken care to make sure all my little corners are well nested. They line up beautifully. So as we continue, we're going to have more nesting. We'll take our first 2. Make sure we have our seams nice and straight. Most important is lining up that seam and getting it nice and straight. So I'll assemble the first 3, press them all nice and flat, and I'll be back to continue. Here's my first row. Everything lines up beautifully. And on this one, I'll do the same so that I can easily nest when I attach the rows together. And here's my second row. And we'll move on to our last row. Again, nesting very carefully. You want to make sure those points all line up really nice. And our third row. So now we'll start attaching our rows together. There's going to be a lot of nesting on these rows because of all the little squares. So you may want to get out your pins to keep everything in place where it should be. If you're comfortable without the pins, that's fine too. This is quite a simple block. It's not hard to do, but it does involve careful nesting. So it's great for that practice. Make sure this lines up nicely. I prefer to put pins in it and try and keep it nice and straight. And this last one. That looks good. Okay, so I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam along it and press it again. You always want to press. And I'll be back to attach the bottom row. There we go, everything nested. All my seams pressed nice and flat. You want to be sure to press your seams. Keep your block flat. And the last row. Once again, I'm going to pin all my seams to make sure they nest perfectly. Nesting is not difficult. It just takes a little practice and a little patience. And before you know it, you'll be a pro at nesting seams. There's one. Line this one up. I think it's worth it to take a second to pin it. And that way you're sure it's not going to move while you're sewing. I'll get this one. And I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam again, of course. And press, press, press. You want to do a lot of pressing. Keep it nice and flat. And I'll be back to show you the finished block. And here we are, all done. I'm pleased with how all my corners line up. All my nesting is done well. With a little patience, I need to square it up, of course. and take away all the excess little threads that I have hanging on the back and here. I'll get that done. So I hope you're going to enjoy making this checkerboard quilt block. I think it's cute with a pop of color in the center. Once again, if you're not already participating in our monthly challenge, you can find my Facebook link in the description right under this video where you can join in on our Block of the Month challenge. I hope you're going to enjoy this quilt block. Thank you for watching.